Welcome to Swami Reacts. Today we will be exploring Walter Brueggemann's The Prophetic Imagination. I've came to know about the author Walter Brueggemann from my beloved friend, elder, mentor, Father Richard Rohr. He considers Walter Brueggemann one of the most brilliant scholars and most authoritative scholars on the Old Testament. So that in itself caught my attention. Okay, someone who is very special to me, then that person immediately becomes special at the same time. Last year when I was visiting Father Richard, then I went to Santa Fe, New Mexico, and I also visited another friend and inspiration, Rabbi Nahum, Ward-Lev, and he was actually studying the prophetic imagination, not only reading himself, but with a group of friends, and he actually generously invited me to participate in. So he spoke to me specifically about the book, Prophetic Imagination, and I was captured enough to the point of, okay, I have to get a copy of this. So I got it, I've read it, I quote-unquote finished it. It's not a finishable book. Unlike the back cover says, if you only read one book this year, let it be The Prophetic Imagination by Walter Brueggemann. Well, I have read this book now in January, beginning of this year, so I'm not able to say this is the book to read during the whole year if you are only to read one, but I'm tempted to say, though I will read a few more during this year, no doubt this will be a very, very inspiring one, very interesting one, very refined, very powerful. Very glad to having discovered such a person, such an author, and so sad to know that he passed from this world relatively recently. But basically, let's share a few thoughts about this work and some sections from the work with you and ruminate together on this. The book is called The Prophetic Imagination. In itself, the title says a lot. I personally love the word prophets, though it may come maybe more immediately related to the Christian tradition. In itself speaks about someone who speaks for God, someone who lives their life, her life in such a way that the divine will is spoken through, how that person walks their talk. So in my second book, Radical Personalism, actually there's a whole section of a living school of prophets. That's another way of articulating the notion of parampara, that we may call as disciple succession, how the chain of masters and students and how the knowledge is not only being copy-pasted, but being transpassed in a living wire, living a live tradition, where the content becomes more and more significant and expanded and deep and broad. So we are all called to become prophets. So this book speaks about prophets and prophetic imagination, how a prophet, how a seer, how a visionary dares to imagine an alternative reality, especially in the face of oppression, in the face of a situation when it's not easy to see an alternative reality, how you can keep your imagination, your prophetic imagination in place. So it's very inspiring and very applicable, again, to someone beyond the particular Christian affiliation, but to anyone living their life affiliated to a particular spiritual community or not, how to take advantage of imagination. Because many times we may think imagination means sheer fantasy, science fiction, something not real, mental speculation, who knows what. But daring to imagine do things that actually are very possible, but won't be ever possible if first we don't dare to imagine them. That's such a crucial exercise for each one of us to keep hope in place, especially again in the midst of those situations, realities where we feel there's no hope, there's nothing new coming here, this will be continued to replicate and get worse and worse. Then we need prophetic imagination. So I'll go through a few sections of the book that I've highlighted here and ruminate with you. Chew on the contents. Punapunas charvita charvananam. Chew what has already been chewed. So Walter Brueggemann says, and you will very quickly realize the uniqueness, the refined English he uses, and it's an academic book, but it's not very difficult to read, let's put it that way, in comparison to other academic books. And there is a lot of depth, and a lot of poetry, and a lot of philosophy and theology, but very thick with content. These are the books that you read them and you have this sense of There's so much more that I'm not catching in my first read, so I may need to go here over and over again. And I've talked to many people who tell me they read this particular book basically once every year minimum. So let's get a glimpse, get a trailer of it. One section, speaking about prophet, what's a prophet? So Walter Brueggemann will say the prophet does not ask if the vision can be implemented, for questions of implementation are of no consequence until the vision can be imagined. The imagination must come before the implementation. Our culture is competent to implement almost anything and to imagine almost nothing. This book was written, by the way, like 50 years ago, but it's quite up to date. This was one of the sections that blew my mind. How imagination must come before implementation. I will say Sambandha must come before Avideya. Sambandha is not just getting the right knowledge, what is what. Of course, yes, getting the right knowledge, and if you get it, you will be able to imagine all that it can be, the potential. In terms of potential, you can conceive endless horizons of possibilities. That's so tied to my recent book, Evolution and Divine Love. It's so tied to a proper, prophetic, contextualized, realistic imagination. It's not about just implementing, especially in the society we live, about doing, human doings, implementing, producing. But first you have to dare to imagine, especially imagine alternatives. He say it is the intent of every totalitarian regime. He uses the word throughout the book royal consciousness to refer to the empire, to the current status quo that doesn't offer an alternative, oppressive, and so on. So it is the intent of every totalitarian regime to force the future to be only an unquestioned continuation of the present. In other words, a totalitarian regime doesn't offer an alternative, doesn't offer newness, perspective, ever-evolving, unfolding. It is what it is, and it will continue to be this way for eternity. No disruption. Just order, 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 an overdose of order. You have a totalitarian regime. So a prophet is necessary to disrupt the order. Even sometimes religious order, religious totalitarianism, suffocating spirituality. Prophets need to come, disrupt that status quo, disrupt that comfort zone. And before speaking about implementing, first we need to dare to imagine. And as he will say, our culture can implement almost everything, but can imagine almost nothing. The faculty of imagination has become stagnant, so to say. So we have to pay attention to that. In this connection, in terms of imagining, we also will require certain language to express what we are imagining, to articulate or re-articulate what we are seeing and foreseeing and conceiving. So he says, Walter Brueggemann says, the prophet is engaged in a battle for language, in an effort to create a different epistemology out of which another community might emerge. Epistemology means a way of knowing things. The evocation of an alternative reality consists, at least in part, in the battle for language and the legitimization of a new rhetoric. That's another important point that I'm very passionate about. Language, articulation. It's not just semantics, it's not just grammar and words, it's not a technical affair, but a necessary way of giving shape to what you are imagining. If you don't have a word to name something, it doesn't exist. We don't have a language, we cannot voice it. We cannot speak about the things that we need to speak, that we need to imagine. So it's a battle for language. And again, in an oppressive system, there's a corresponding glossary, corresponding language that accompanies the oppression, the totalitarian regime. And you cannot go beyond that. So in order to disrupt that order, you need a new language that speaks in ways that you probably did not dare to imagine, but that language takes you to conceive that possibility, to imagine that new, brighter future, to give hope. The role of language is to create hopefulness. It's not just mere opening your mouth, but open your mouth and invoke hope for everyone by an articulation of a new reality, by invoking newness. And that part of articulation has to do with new ways of speaking about the divine even, because if we have misreadings about the divine, probably we misread everything else in reality because the root source was misread to begin with, or was misspelled, so to say, misdescribed. If we describe God in a very oppressive way, in a very authoritarian way, in a very fearful way, in a very partial, limited way, filtered and filled with assumptions and prejudice of our own, that will pervade how we see everything and everyone. So part of the re-articulation and the battle for language is in how do we speak about God? How do we dare to think about God? How we are imagining God? Again, in a realistic way. So Walter Brueggemann will say, we are indeed made in the image of God, following his Christian belief. And perhaps we have no more important theological investigation than to discern in whose image we have been made. Okay, we are made in the image of God. Who is that God? Because if we have a toxic notion of God and I'm made in that image, then I immediately have a toxic image of myself and of everything. So perhaps he will say we have no more important theological inquiry than to discern ongoingly in the image of whom we have been made. Who is our source? And how, because that will affect how I see myself and how I see everything. And he, on another section, will say the newness of God, speaking about an ever-evolving divine, the newness of God is the only serious source of energy. I love that one. The newness of God is the only serious source of energy. If some so-called energy comes from an absence of newness, that's not energizing at all. That's not empowering at all. It has to come from something that is ever-evolving, ever-fresh, ever new, in constant expansion. In the context of love, that's a coherent divine. That's the only real source of energizing, of empowering, real Shakti. And us being seeing ourselves, and us seeing the world, and us seeing everything in connection to that reality that brings newness, that brings prospect, that brings hope, horizon, possibilities. And many times in the context of that, in the context of articulating a new reality of hope, a coherent divine, we also need to bring symbols, which are not only maybe words, but maybe another way of speaking, another way of symbolizing, illustrating a prospect. So Walter Brueggemann also addresses the importance of proper symbology, proper symbolic language to express what needs to be expressed at any given moment. He says what takes place when symbols are inadequate and things may not be brought to public expression is that the experience will not be experienced. The experience we need to be experiencing is not being experienced by using symbols, but inadequate ones. And therefore we cannot bring to public expression, we cannot articulate what needs to be brought to the surface. And in that context, in another section of the book, he's quoting R.D. Laing from a book, The Politics of Experience, a very powerful one-liner. He says, if our experience is destroyed, we were talking about that if proper symbols are not there, we cannot voice and articulate something there, therefore the experience won't be experienced. And then this quote says, if our experience is destroyed, our behavior will be destructive. Try to apply that to the world we are living today. So much destructive behavior, self-destructive and destructive to others. Why? Probably because the experience has not been experienced. Whatever we needed to experience, we didn't. Starting from the fact that we are being unconditionally loved and accepted infinitely. So on the foundation of that lack of experience and a lack of language and symbology to articulate even what we need to experience, we will lack the experience and we'll have a destructive behavior. So part of all this, and this is central to Walter Brueggemann's prophetic imagination, is in terms of expressing, voicing, articulating, is grief, which is another important element that I tend to emphasize a lot. The language of grief. He says the real criticism begins in the capacity to grieve, because that is the most visceral announcement that things are not right. There's always something that is not right going on, whether it is on a social level, social, political, personal, local, family, group, community. There's something that needs upgrades, needs refinement, needs observation, needs to be spoken about. And grief is a way of expressing that. When we are grieving, we are voicing our concern, we are voicing our sadness, we are voicing our loss, we are making it clear something is not correct. So that's a real critique in a healthy way. But we have to create sacred space and time for grieving, which is, again, not very much inculcated in our modern culture. Grieving sometimes is something not very much appreciated, something feared. And he will express in his book that apathy is the absence of pathos. And pathos in Greek will mean emotional expression, and very much connected many times to grief. An emotional expression of our grief. What's the opposite of that? Apathy, which we understand it means basically like absolute indifference and denial. So the importance of grief to not create apathy. And of course, again, in the society, in the world we are living many times, even in religious world we are living, we try to not confront these important elements, to not address these necessary voices that need to be brought to the table. And we try to create a culture of superficial harmony, or even a culture of satiation. That's a word that Walter Brueggemann will speak, and it's quite applicable to the world we are living. It reminds me of Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, where everyone is utterly satiated, satisfied, but basically they are living in hell. So he says, it is difficult to keep a revolution of freedom and justice underway when there is satiation, when there is some discomfort that is being felt, that is being seen, that is being voiced, that is allowed to be voiced, and then we start to imagine what we can do about it. So it's very important to confront this numbness, this satiation, with a proper voicing and articulation of grief. And also in connection to that, Walter Brueggemann will speak about amazement. That's another beautiful part of the book. He addresses amazement, and he says that the language of amazement is against the despair, just as the language of grief is against the numbness. So we need these two elements, all in proper place. Grieving, healthy grieving to counteract numbness and unhealthy satiation, and amazement to counteract despair, hopelessness, and so on. So all this is part of the task of a prophet, actually. We can call it a teacher, a master, a guru, a visionary, a seer, a rishi. We'll say a seer, a wise person, to give a vision, to provide a new vision, new horizon, a new way to think and imagine the possibilities that lie upon us. So Walter Brueggemann will say in this connection, the task, therefore, going back to the title of the book, the Prophetic Imagination, the task of prophetic imagination and ministry is to bring to public expression those very hopes and yearnings that have been denied so long and suppressed so deeply that we no longer know they are there. I know many of you that I've talked with, and I'm not foreign to that experience myself, sometimes even in the context of certain situations in life, certain social dynamics, relationship, even affiliation with certain religious institution, we may feel that I'm running dry, I'm being suffocated, I'm being oppressed, my hopes are disappearing, my yearnings are shut off, are denied, I'm not given a voice, I'm not having permission to be myself. So the task of a prophet is to bring to public expression those needs, to validate, to reclaim, to redeem those needs, those yearnings that we all need to keep in place. And let me conclude with one last section from the book. He says, to be sure, the prophet lives in tension with the tradition. While the prophet is indeed shaped by the tradition, breaking free from the tradition to assert the new freedom of God is also characteristic of the prophet. So a prophet is not a heretic that leaves the tradition and throws stones from the outside. Also, the prophet is not that an ultra insider that becomes so biased that loses sight of what needs to be critiqued and changed. So the prophet remains in the tradition, but lives in tension with the tradition. Is also criticizing the tradition out of love for the tradition, as I also remember speaking about in radical personalism. So someone who is so much in love with his or her own lineage that dares to criticize for the continuation and growth and expansion of it, in essence. So it's a constant creative tension in which the prophet lives in. So it was a great experience. I hope you dare to explore this particular work. Very interesting. For me, it was very revealing in many ways, and one of those, and hopefully I'm not sounding narcissistic nor too self-referential and then self-reverential, but while reading this book in many ways, I found, wow, this author 50 years ago, half a century ago, is articulating many of the efforts that I've been personally trying to intuitively implement in my life as I practice, as I live, in my teachings, as I share and as I write, and even in the formation of Tadatmya Sangha, the community that we have started a few years ago. So somehow I felt, okay, it's all connected to what he's describing here, the need to voice certain things, to articulate certain things in a certain way, to present a coherent definition of God, to keep God's newness in place in evolution. And again, I'm not saying any of that is my personal separate merit, just the necessity of the moment that I think all of us, because all of us at the end of the day are invited to become prophets. So I'm not here making any public claim, I am the prophet now. We are all invited to become prophets, to develop a way of seeing that can, again, dare to imagine an alternative future, articulate how that will look like, and gradually implement that. But first, imagining, articulating, grieving what needs to be grieved, being amazed. We need to be amazed through that new articulation and conception of a never new God. And then we can talk about Avideya, about implementation and then prayojan, the result of that. But first, let's stay with Sambandha, proper orientation, proper conception, conceptualizing, imagination in a prophetic way, visionary way. So we are all invited to participate in being a prophet in this living school of prophets. So, speaking of participation, if you have read Walter Brueggemann's The Prophetic Imagination, please feel free to share in the comment section any thoughts and experiences that you've had through your own reading. And if you hadn't, still you are invited to participate by sharing what it felt like to hear these words about the book, if something was touching you, and whatever you would like to share with us to enrich the conversation. It's ongoing. See you in the next one, session episode of Swami Reacts.